show. So last weekend, I had the very great privilege of speaking at the Brisbane rally against the digital ID, which is a government proposition that would ultimately force Australians to hand just about all their data over to the state on one platform under the guise, of course, of safety. This digital ID would be sold to Australians largely under the banner of convenience. I mean, after all, nobody likes fiddling around in their wallets for their driver's licence, credit cards, Medicare card and all the rest, so why wouldn't we want everything in one place? Well, joining me to tell you exactly why we should all be very, very afraid of the digital ID is one of my fellow speakers who was at the rally against the digital ID, Chief Economist at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, the wonderful John Humphreys. John, amazing to have you here this evening. How have you been?
G'day, Daisy. I've been doing great. Another beautiful day in paradise up here.
Fantastic. Yes, it is a gorgeous day up there. I can see that lovely sunlight streaming through that rattlesnake flag, which I really, really like as a backdrop, by the way. Very, very nice. Now, John, you and I were both at the digital ID rally. You spoke, I spoke. Tell me, how did you feel about the rally? You know, what did you feel about the vibe? Did you have a nice time?
I had a good time. There were great speakers there, a good lineup of speakers. I got to say, like I said at the rally, I really appreciated Malcolm Roberts brought us together, as you would know. And as I said at the time, for a rally like this, a movement like this, a pushback against the government to work, it can't really just be coming from one political party. And I really appreciated that Malcolm went out of his way to bring in people. Of course, he's with One Nation, and he went out of his way to bring in people who weren't associated with One Nation to speak and to come along to the rally. So I thought I really appreciated that from Malcolm. So another thank you to Malcolm for that. And look, it was a great vibe. People seemed energetic. They seemed interested. And it was relatively packed there. I didn't know what to expect, but I thought it went well.
Yes, me too. I mean, I loved your speech. I had fun speaking, and there was a good turnout there. I got there and I was like, oh my God, King George Square is full. So obviously there are enough people out there who are concerned about the digital ID, which is good to see people are awake to it. Now, John, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about this digital ID and the bill that I think is going to be examined again in Parliament later in the year. But the one that you have focused on is the power in the hands of the person who controls what would be a central access point to all of our information. What assurance have we received, if any, that our data would be safe and untouchable?
What assurances could we receive? Look, they have attempted to write safeguards into the legislation. And I've got to say, I prefer there to be safeguards than not be safeguards. But realistically, long-term, how much faith can we put in these safeguards? As I mentioned in my talk on the day, there's a couple of strategies you can go to when you have that amount of power. You could trust in the wisdom and benevolence of our political and bureaucratic leaders. You could trust all future bureaucrats to be able to keep to the safeguards. Realistically, we've got a long track record of government programs, and they grow. If the government program doesn't work, that's used as evidence that it didn't have enough money and it gets more money and power. If a government program does work, that's used as evidence that it's a great idea and it needs more money and power. Either way, we've got a long track record in Australia and around the world of government projects growing well past the point where they start. So there are some safeguards written in right now. My bigger concern is, where does this go? You give a government agency this much power, you can write in all the safeguards in the world. Eventually, a bureaucrat or politician will look at this amount of power and think, you know what, I could use that. And they may well be thinking they're going to use it for good at the time. But once that power starts creeping up, it's a one-way ratchet. And look, the only real way to stay safe from this sort of power is to make sure we never centralize this much power in one place at any time. So we've got to push back against the centralization of power. Even if there's safeguards written in at the moment, we need to make sure that the only foolproof safeguard is to make sure there is not this much centralization of power in the first place.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the problem with politicians. I think a lot of people think that politicians are their friends. You know, oh, well, you know, as a politician, he's working in my best interest. And I think the problem in Australia, and I raised this, is that we are so used to living in an all-encompassing welfare state that means we're really, really, really used to having a whole lot of government involved in our day-to-day affairs. So do you think the problem is that a lot of Australians might just embrace the digital ID because they're used to everything being so centralised in terms of government?
Yeah, a few things to unpack there. One, I'd say on the politicians, in my experience, most politicians are relatively decent people. There is a misconception out there that politics could be fixed if we just replace the bad politicians with a group of wise and benevolent future politicians. I don't think it is the nature of the personality of the current politicians that's the problem. It's the total amount of power that is centralized in the hands of politicians and bureaucrats. You give any group of people that much power, and on a long enough time horizon, it's going to be used and abused. So I think that's one point to make about politicians. The second point you were making there, sorry, I've forgotten what the second point you made.
That is totally fine. I was talking about how we live in such a big welfare state that Australians are really used to having a lot of government in their lives.
Look, this is likely to pass in the lower house soon. And when it does, realistically, people are going to embrace it in the short term, partly because they have to. I mean, realistically, it's called voluntary. It's going to be voluntary in name only. When they threatened to introduce the Australia card 40 years ago, they introduced a new term called pseudo-voluntary. I guess that's one way of going about it. But realistically, in the short term, they're probably not going to abuse it straight away. And in the short term, there's going to be a convenience. And realistically, if you want access to your online banking, if you want access to an increasing number of things that's going to require this, everyone's going to sign up. I think that's inevitable. I guess my sadness comes from the fact that many people will sign up happily. Many of us will be forced to sign up grudgingly. But you're absolutely right. There is a degree to which in Australia, I think people have forgotten the underlying cause of our freedom and prosperity. And that comes from skepticism of government and a healthy amount of freedom and responsibility at the local and family and individual level. And I think to some degree, people now feel like you can take that for granted and then just go and get added extras when they're convenient. But that's not really true. If you take away the bedrock of our society, the thing that gave us our freedom and prosperity, it's not necessarily true you get to keep all of your freedom and prosperity. And it's worth actually fighting for that now.
Yes, exactly. You know, there were a lot of sort of temporary measures, for instance, that governments introduced after wartime, for instance, like the income tax and the passport that were billed as, temporary, well, however many years on, and we still have them. Now, so yes, always, never trust that kind of thing in the hands of governments. Now, look, John, there are, some pro-digital ID arguments other than convenience. Some of them look at using the digital ID system to enforce age verification on pornography websites. But I'm thinking, can't safeguards exist for these websites independently of a government-controlled system?
That seems like a very strange argument to me. We already have ID. One thing to note about the government's digital ID is it's not really a new ID. It's based off your existing ID. It's based off your driver's license and your Medicare card, and you're bundling it all together, and the government's creating a new single portal which will be used to access services, access everything in the future. This is my main concern, right? That they're bundling it together to create an access point. But it's not a new ID. So the IDs that it bundles together already exist, and you can already use those IDs to prove your age in other situations. So I guess the argument being put forward by the proponents of the digital ID is at least digital ID will make it slightly more convenient to access porn. I mean, because they're saying it increases the convenience. You've already got the ID. Now they're saying now here's a more convenient ID. All right, so what's the argument linked to porn here? You've got ID. You're just making it more convenient? That seems like a strange argument to me.
Yes, it certainly does seem like a strange argument. And look, just before we go, John, jumping sideways a bit, I'd love just a quick take from you on this. The government announced that $3 billion worth of student debt, which seems like a generous move, has been, forgiven, so to speak, recently. But isn't it just cleaning up its mess from last year with the indexation and all of that?
Yes and no. The mess from last year doesn't come from any laws that the government put in place last year. Our HEX debt has been indexed to CPI, to inflation, for a long time. I would argue that that's not a great idea for a very different reason. The current people complaining about HEX say that how dare the debt go up, I would say HECS debt should have a normal interest rate, like all other interest rates, all other loans. And the counter argument from the people in favor of their debt forgiveness is that their real argument is they don't like having to pay off their loans.
Mm.
But they seem to be arguing that these loans, education loans, are so powerfully important. The truth is, you don't need everyone in the country to go to university for 10 years doing 3 master's degrees in basket weaving and lesbian dance theory. We need people to we need people to go to university when the benefits of their degrees will exceed the costs. And that means we need them to make an assessment. This is going to be the benefit of me going to uni, and this is going to be the cost. Now, we don't want them to face the cost up front because we want to make sure people have access to university. That's a great part of our system.
Mm.
But we need them to face a real cost, the real resource cost of going to university, so that they only go to university when it's worth it. We don't need everyone going there whether it's worth it or not. We need people going to university when it's worth it. And some people are saying, oh, look, if I have to actually pay the true costs of going to university, it might not be worth it, so I might not go. To which I say, okay, if it's not worth it, don't go. It's not compulsory. You should only go when it's worth it. And they're saying, oh, but if you just made all the costs go away, then I could go. Yeah, but someone else is picking up those costs. You know who picks up those costs?
All
People
of the
who
rest
didn't
of
get
us.
to go to university.
Yeah.
Well, specifically, people who didn't get to go to university get to pay extra tax so that they can fund other people to either study some hobby that's not very useful or to study some degree that is useful, in which case they should pay for it themselves.
I think you make excellent points there, and I agree with you. We should be talking to teenagers very seriously about the cost of university and encouraging them to make a cost-benefit analysis rather than blindly pushing everyone to go to university, because there are many, 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 many wonderful things you can do with your life that generate an income that do not involve studying lesbian dance theory for 10 years. John Humphreys, you are fantastic. So great to have you on the program, and I do hope we can chat to you again soon.
It was fun, Daisy. Thanks a lot.